So you said earlier that it kind of separates itself from Imperator. So if you can kind of like highlight what reasons do you feel like it kind of sets itself apart from Imperator in terms of separating the countries, so they all feel different.
I think part of that is just the nature of the decadence system, which I would like Tortuga to talk about a little bit.
I think it's the modifiers, actually. Sorry to jump over you, but I think it's mostly about the modifiers. That the different nations, like, in my head, a lot of the times when I'm thinking about this game, I am comparing it to Imperator Rome or any of the Paradox titles. But instead of, I think they were very bold in their decision to choose modifiers that, like the typical modifiers you'll see for these games is like, oh, plus 10% economy or plus 10% manpower. And there's some of those in there too, but they really have some specific modifiers. And I feel like it's a trade-off. Paradox games are probably allowing you to do things a little more ahistorically, but that also takes away some of the flavor of these nations. So you can play almost any nation maybe successfully and maybe in any way you want. Maybe, I don't really know. I didn't dive into Imperator Rome I only think I played like 10 hours or so. But in this game, they have very restrictive, but also empowering modifiers that do some pretty severe things. And that was actually my mistake when I first played this game. I was having a really hard time getting into it. And I think I was playing it too much like a general game. I was not really paying attention to the modifiers or, towing my nation to what I was reading there. And they have like the scripting system that they have built into the modifiers is pretty extensive. So they'll have modifiers that are just like, this unit will get one bonus, this thing. I mean, they get into the weeds with it to try to curve your nation slanted towards a particular direction, which presumably is the historical direction of that nation.
Does Imperator not have like those modifiers for like units?
Well, what's the Imperator's modifiers?
Well, from what I understand, like I know they're customizing units in Imperator based upon, like for example, the Romans can focusing on sieging, and each can go down their own separate paths, from what I understand.
Yeah, but I think a big difference is like the actual modifiers for Carthage, per my understanding, in Imperator or in Empires, getting the two confused, is like Carthage has some pretty big modifiers, but they're more focused on like economics. And there are some modifiers with their military as well, but it's all geared around replicating the fact that Carthage is a merchant state. And actually, historically, would demobilize soldiers at times that it was probably unwise because their elders just or their I don't whatever the equivalent of their ruling class was just of the opinion this war that's going on, it's a little bit too expensive and there's not a lot going on right now, so let's start demobilizing some of our troops and that or navies. And because really their focus was commerce, their focus was trade, and I do feel like the modifiers that exist in Empire really bring that out in a way that even if Imperator has modifiers, I'm not sure it really is giving the character flavor to how running Carthage is different. Maybe fighting, maybe different global modifiers based on the territory you're in, but I don't feel like the economy is my primary focus for Carthage in Imperator any more than it is in Rome. Whereas I do feel like there are very different focuses for countries in Field of Glory Empire.
Yeah, I mean, here, I can give you one example. This is a very specific one. I just pulled up the game. I'm in the scenario, like, loadout thing, so I can just click on the different nations. Antigone. They have a modifier called In the Eye of the Storm. And this is how specific this gets. They're supposed to be at war with people, so they get a 25% equipment bonus, which helps you recruit troops. They get free units, support 6, so they get 6 free units. And now listen to this. I'm going to read this verbatim. As such, each turn Antigonid is not at war, the government ages an extra turn. So that's decadence related. You don't want to age. Your government is basically it's falling apart. Each turn the nation has at least 3 wars with neighbors, the government doesn't age. If the nation is embroiled in 6 or more wars with neighbors, the government slightly rejuvenates. That's a very specific modifier. So they're really trying to shoehorn you into going to war with a lot of different people.
So basically, if you don't go to war, like you just die. Like eventually, the game ends because you're not following that goal for that country.
It's not so bad. I mean, basically, it's obviously not good. You don't want to age. You want your government to be doing well. But if you go into a slump and your government continues to decline, there's like a reset button. You can kind of think of it as like the bankruptcy of decadence. You just have a civil war which will fire. And then the two new nations both have their governments reset. So there is a reset on it, and that's nice. You just have to fight. I mean, you have to fight a civil war for it, but it's kind of like the like a rebellion timer that I've seen in Europa Universalis, stuff like that.
And I mean, it's also if you have like a really warlike people and they're not happy that all of a sudden you're not playing to your culture, then it seems to me logical that you'd have some dissent internally, and it could lead to a rebellion. And potentially a warlike party coming in. I mean, it's interesting the way you're talking about this, Eric, because this is, I think the thing that Paradox does well is if you want a true sandbox experience, they do a really good job of that, right? You can play any country, and it's not that any country is great, right? Like if you're playing Europea Universalis as like Brunei or something like that, you're not going to conquer the world, certainly not as easily as if you're playing Britain. So it's not like every country is equal, but at least in terms of being able to jump in and play to your own play style, I do feel like the Paradox games are kind of like play how you want to play, and you've got a few trees you can go down with the different techs and research, but it's not really about shoehorning you into saying like this is the experience that this country is going to be. And I think Empires does a much better job of that. They're trying to do two different things, so better might be the wrong word. I don't want to criticize Paradox when their design intent is pretty clear, but I do think it's a different experience with Empires, and I think that really leads to a true sense of a unique flavor that each country can bring to the game, and that adds for more diversity. Again, if you don't want that constant warfare, don't play as that country. There's over 70 different countries for you to choose from.
Yeah, and I think that that's what I was trying to say earlier on, is that this game is more into kind of the historical flavor. You can tell by the way the people who did this game are complete history nerds. They have all the details in there. And it kind of reminds me of the difference. I mean, look at the comparison with Imperator Rome is inevitable, and really just it's impossible to avoid even immediately. So I would compare this game more of like a Hearts of Iron 3. It's got the historical details built in, whereas I would call Imperator Rome more of like a Hearts of Iron 4, where it's less about what should happen historically and more about this idea of just more sandbox, so you can do whatever you want. And I kind of feel like the people who make this game are actually they want more of a historical game. They want you kind of to experience more of history. Whereas Imperator Rome is more about let's let people have this, the sandbox. Again, it's to let them kind of experiment. But because you actually have to play the different nations in this one differently, I feel like it's more, you would have a better sense of that nation historically by playing it in this one versus Rome, yeah.